Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today, HR Strategy Consulting webinar. And our topic today, federal pay equity. Are you ready? My name is Peter Santini. I am the Vice President HR Management Consulting Practice here at HR Strategies Consulting. I'll be your webcast host today on our webinar. And today's topic on federal pay equity, or pay equity in general. The new federal pay equity legislation in Canada aims to transform the pay equity model from a complaint-based model to a proactive model. So Quebec and Ontario began this transition, and we can learn some lessons from their initiatives. And we hope to share some of that today. And the journey to compliance, of course, is going to take some time. And why not start your engines and start the journey off in the right direction? So today, joining us as web presenters, we have Francois Pisoneau, who is currently the Director of Compensation at Bell Canada. Francois is an accomplished compensation professional with over 30 years of experience and very familiar with Quebec and Ontario in terms of pay equity legislation and the federal pay equity legislation. And we also have Barb Duffin, who is owner-principal of Shem Consulting. Barb is a dedicated and passionate HR comp leader. She's been doing this in the comp world for about 25 years or more, and very, very familiar with the Ontario pay equity scenarios. So I'd like to welcome Francois and Barb to the webcast. And we're going to start going into it. And our discussion today will focus on basically a quick overview of our obligations and timelines. What can you do to prepare your organization? Some key questions you should consider. And hopefully we'll be able to give you some useful tips and ideas. So I'm going to ask Francois to give us the overview of the Canadian pay equity landscape. Over to you, Francois.
Thank you, Peter. So as mentioned earlier, while Ontario pay equity dates back to the 80s, the Canadian Human Rights Act introduced pay equity principles back in 1977 at the federal level. The complaint-based model resulted in multiple complaints and decades-long lawsuits, including companies like Canada Post, Air Canada, and even Bell, where I worked, that were caught in those lawsuits. So in 2001, a special independent pay equity task force was set up to fix the problem at the federal level. It was followed by a second one in 2016, recommending many aspects similar to the Ontario and Quebec proactive pay equity legislation. And basically, this is how we ended up here today. Ultimately, I would qualify the new federal pay equity, while not fully finalized yet, as closer to the Quebec model. As you can see on the slide, same kind of 60-60 predominance levels, requirements for a committee with employees' representatives, a formal ongoing audit requirements, and annual filings. However, it also has its own particularities, and just to name a few, like executives, dependent contractors, and freelancers are in scope. Yes, executives are in scope of this Pay Equity Act. Prescriptive methodology to compare job value and compensation are also set up. And while the government bodies can rely on already existing job evaluation, this has not yet been extended to private sector employers. Also, you'll find an extremely weird voting system for the committee, like one vote for the employer and one vote for all of the employees. If this is not unanimous, then the employee's vote becomes void. Finally, in many circumstances, you are to refer back to the Pay Equity Commissioner if you have issues, questions, or requests, and they will answer back with a decision. However, with no specific timeline limit to get back to you. So many representations were made to the government by both employers, unions, and other lobbying bodies to change aspects of the law. While we're still awaiting final regulation at this point in time, you may want to start looking into this sooner than later. Back to you, Peter.
All Alrighty, so we'll go on to the next slide. I'll ask Barb to now give us an overview on the Ontario pay equity landscape. Over to you, Barb.
Thanks, Peter, and hello to everyone. The Ontario Pay Equity Act, as I'm sure most of you know, was designed with the intention of ensuring equal pay for work of equal value and was proclaimed way back in 1997. I'm going to turn to the next slide, Peter. And as I said, the intention of the Ontario Pay Equity Act was to help close the wage gap. And the women currently earn, on average, 24% less than men. And that was the gap the legislation had been designed or intended to close. I want to turn to the next slide. So one of the questions that I think is worth looking at is, why did this all come about in the first place? And it was because of the wage gap. And I think there's some good information historically here in terms of what's contributed to that wage gap. I think the first one's kind of obvious. Women enter and leave the workforce more than men, typically to have children, although that's changing a bit. They have lower seniority levels as a result and experience less salary increases outside of bargaining unit situations. Many of the kinds of jobs women do are undervalued compared to the work done by men. And I think the third point here is a pretty important one. There are more male-dominated jobs in unionized environments, which drive up levels of pay for men. I can remember doing a pay equity analysis years ago for an ironworks company, and the lowest level unionized male job, which was a janitor with no specialized skills, was paid $10,000 more than the executive assistant. So there's an example of the union's bargaining power increasing wages for a male job in an organization, and that was just one scenario within that organization. So pay equity in that particular circumstance was necessary in order to alleviate that wage gap. And I think the last point, one can argue this however you want to argue it, but definitely the Pay Equity Commission in Ontario takes the position, and always has, that it's a given that the market is biased against women, and as a result, using any kind of argument around market is really not allowed unless you can meet their requirements for market shortage, which are pretty strict. So it's not that you can say, oh, the market data for that female-dominated job is lower than the male, so automatically I'm okay to pay it differently. You've got to really prove you've done your research and prove that that's a trend, not just using the market data you might be using for your organization. So you have to prove that widely. Do you want to switch slides, Peter? So the organizations in Ontario that are governed by the Ontario Pay Equity Act are all public sector employers in Ontario, any private sector employers that are provincially regulated with more than 10 employees as of 1997. And as we know, for years there was federal legislation, and it wasn't as strict as Ontario, but it sounds like it might actually be moving to being more strict than what we have in Ontario. Do you want to switch to the next slide? Thanks. So how is the guidelines within the Pay Equity Act intended to help close this known wage gap? Well, it wanted to, or intended to start by ensuring that you understand the value of all your jobs, and you're paying based on that value, and showing that you're paying based on that, not based on gender. And of course, that requires a gender-neutral job evaluation system. We're going to talk a bit more about this, but pay equity is not internal equity. Pay equity is when you've proven that how you compensate your female-dominated jobs is fair and equal in comparison to how you pay your male-dominated jobs. So you must prove you don't discriminate against women in your compensation practices. It's all about your strategic decision-making around compensation. So you can't just say, we don't discriminate. You have to prove it. And you can't just show a compensation policy and say, we have fair and equitable system that meets the requirements of the Ontario Pay Equity Act. Again, you have to prove it. You have to go through the analysis job by job for your female-dominated jobs and prove that you're paying them at least the same, if not more, than your male-dominated jobs. I'm going to switch slides. So I wanted to speak a little bit about the evolution of pay equity in Ontario, and it started and still is complaint-based legislation. And in the beginning, there were a lot of cases of trying to sort out who the employer was and what a female-dominated job was and how you found male comparators. And then as the years passed, that complaint-based legislation took on a new element where the Pay Equity Commission was doing some proactive audits. And I had a number of clients that were audited, and literally we got on the phone with the Pay Equity Commission. We explained the gender-neutral job evaluation system we were using, how we applied it, how we ensured there were no adjustments, and that was the end of that. It could be put to rest with a phone call as long as they knew you were committed or believed you were committed to the spirit and the compliance requirements in the Ontario Pay Equity Act. They were willing to move on. Then it increased again, still of course being complaint-based and still having this audit procedure, but now they had the power to ask for your actual compensation and payroll records and to actually consider analyzing your pay equity compliance themselves. And it's interesting because that was a very far-reaching change that happened, but honestly, there hasn't been a lot of cases where that's actually happened. So it's fairly quiet. And because of that, I found that a lot of people have forgotten about it and are not necessarily in compliance. They might have been at one time, but they haven't maintained it, or they've moved outside of their compensation programs. But I'm starting to see a new trend where organizations are coming in line again, not because the Ontario Pay Equity Act says they have to, but because they want to be a good employer. They want to have a strong employer brand, and they want to be able to use that to attract quality female candidates to their organization. I'll pass it back to you now, Peter.
Thank you, Barb. And as we continue along the path, I'm going to ask Francois to join us again and take us through the next couple of slides. Over to you, Francois.
Yes, thank you. So on this slide, I just want to bring to your attention the limited concept around the equity when we say about pay equity. So the purpose of this legislation is to correct systemic discrimination in compensation, specifically for female job classes that you can see in pink on this slide. They do not require you to look at all the other jobs. It simply are, let's say, lower women-dominated jobs being paid fairly against men-dominated jobs. So the key message on this slide is simply to raise awareness on the limited focus. While you have built your jobs and your salary structure to cover each and every one of your employees, the scope of the pay equity legislation can be quite narrower. You can end up in some unusual situation that I have seen in the past where men thinking they're not properly paid don't understand they are not in scope with Pay Equity Act. Or a woman in a gender-neutral job on the right feels that she's not paid enough versus the men colleagues in the same job and could also possibly be out of scope. And finally, another example is you may end up with some predominant woman job in your grade 5 salary structure being increased after the exercise, while all other predominant men or gender neutral jobs in the same grade 5 could possibly remain as is, unless you want to adjust everyone. So this could create a situation where employees' communication will be a challenge, as it is not easy for employees to comprehend the intricacies of these acts at all levels. And that incomprehension from your employees may trigger complaints to the commissioner and then a visit from pay equity inspectors. So hopefully nothing of that will happen, but I just want to draw your attention that it may be not as straightforward as you're measuring everything and everything is covered. If we go to the next slide and go back to the federal pay equity, while the law is not finalized fully, there are some things you may want to start to maybe to get ready to prepare at this point in time. So I put a few of those items here for your consideration. So the law prescribes a single pay equity plan by organization. So for Bell Canada, where I work, it means one plan that goes from St. John's, Newfoundland to Vancouver or Victoria in BC, covering all the unions and all the groups of employees across Canada. So this is somewhat of a challenge, basically. I just want, however, to point out to two situations that are possible under the new law. So it's possible for a group of employers to be recognized as a single employer. So maybe in some circumstances, such an approach can help you if you're relatively small employers and with limited jobs to make the appropriate comparative analysis. So maybe regrouping yourselves can give you access to some predominant men jobs that are needed, or pooled resources to perform your pay equity plan with a pay equity committee potentially. The other possible is to create multiple pay equity plans under a single employer. While the employer can request multiple plans, you must know that it is possible for unions and even non-union employees to request also for multiple plans. So it could be a good strategy if you're coast to coast with various compensation rates, or you have multiple unions, to consider having multiple plans. You just need to remember something, however. If what you're doing carves out enough predominant men jobs available to do a good comparison, it will be automatically denied by the Pay Equity Commissioner. So it may be wise at this point to start discussing with unions, if you have some, to start to understand their views on this. Also, the following point, you may consider performing preliminary analysis. So first of all, do you have all the HR information required in your HRIS system, like employee data, job data, policies, historical information, and so on, in order to get ready? Nothing stops you from analyzing and identifying jobs' gender predominance right away. Also, the federal law stresses out to consider historical and stereotyping patterns. So how far can you go backward with your data to support you? You may have a situation right now that you have gender neutral jobs, but was it the case in the last 10 years? And typically the courts will ask you to go back in time and look at what was the trend in the past. So review your current compensation plans and other compensation elements. Don't forget, you also need salaries, but commissions, bonus, pension, and benefits, and any other advantage received directly or indirectly from the employer that must be included. You can always disregard these items if they are offered uniformly to all of your employees. But if you have scheduled, let's say, a vacation or holidays that differ from one group of employees to another, this needs to be taken into consideration when you do the analysis. Ultimately, also, can you fix some things ahead of time? Nothing stops you right now to do job reclassification if you find something is odd, or revisit your pay structure if you need to. Also, if you have pension plans or benefit plans that are not extended to all employees and may create an issue, maybe it's time to revisit that and review how you provide those coverage to these various employee groups. And who will be on the Pay Equity Committee? So if you are big enough to require such a committee, if you have unions, automatically there will be one representative for each bargaining agents that you have. This is automatic by the new law. Again, I'm stressing that maybe discussing with your union could be a good point here to look at how they feel about all that. Also, you have non-unionized representatives that you will need to elect, at least one member. But maybe you want to consider having more. Nothing stops you from adding other members. If the example I gave you earlier that you have employees from St. John's, Newfoundland to Victoria, could you feel that just one representative at the other end of the country represents everyone accurately? So maybe you need to think that maybe you need a broader representation at that level. And don't forget, you'll need to do elections for non-unionized representative. Also, who will represent the employer? I just want you to consider a woman, since at least 50% of your committee members must be women. So that's a fact that is important to take into consideration. Also, in the end, you need to consider the training requirements for those committee members. They'll come out from the field or from your unions. Do they know job evaluation? Do they know your compensation programs and various plans? I just want you to remember, you will have about 36 months to deliver on the federal pay equity. So you cannot possibly waste 6 of those 36 months to get your committee ready and trained. So it may be a good idea to look at them ahead of time. If we continue on the following page, there's also the job evaluation system that is key under that legislation, like any pay equity legislation. So the questions here, will you be able to use what you already have? I just want to flag you that the jury is still out there on this one. So employers are putting pressure on the government to change the approach. I told you earlier that the law is quite specific. The government can use existing job evaluation, but it's not allowed for the private sector employers. So we have put pressure on the government to ask to change this one. So in the end, the committee may be allowed to decide of reusing what exists. So again, talking to your unions, if you have unions representation, may be a good strategy here. Do you have a valid job evaluation system or process in place? So the criteria for the Federal Pay Equity Act is quite standard to the other ones. So your system needs to look at the skills required to perform the work, the effort required to perform the work, the responsibility required in the performance of the work, and the conditions under which the work is performed. So those 4 aspects are quite common at the various pay equity acts. Are all your job information up to date? How old are your job descriptions? So this is also something that you need to look ahead. And again, I just want to note, draw your attention, the pay equity at the federal level covers executive jobs and dependent contractors. So do you have those descriptions if you need to? And maintain and update your job evaluation. This is something to consider right now. Also, you're allowed, like in other acts, to regroup your jobs under job classes. As long as they have similar responsibilities, qualifications, the same compensation plan, and the same salary range, it's possible to regroup these jobs, and that can help you in your work. Finally, on the comparison of compensation, remember, you need to review all the compensation elements. So it's not just base salary. It will be to add all the other compensation elements into that comparison. And the law prescribes 2 methods, the equal average and the equal line. Honestly, for what is currently known, this is the element that keeps me up at night. So equal line method, which is basically a regression line that you're maybe familiar, is typically always costlier when you do pay equity. So imagine now if you need to add your man executive to that line, what it can do. The other aspect is equal average method, which is a typical mathematical rule of three. This job of 200 points pays $50,000. What about this jobs of 180 points? With such a methodology, however, 0 point equals $0. I don't know of any salary line crossing $0 at 0 point, given that we have minimum wage laws across all the provinces. The other aspect that is a little bit of concern here is assume 100 points for a job of $30,000. This represents $300 per point. Now assume 500 points for a higher end job at $200,000. This is now $400 per point. So the point value may not be the same across your job spectrum, which is quite interesting. So, however, the good news is the committee could agree on a different methodology. So you may need to consider a different approach and potentially sell it to your committee in the end. So again, maybe this, once you begin your analysis, you can find out if there's issues with either of those two methodologies and potentially find maybe a third one that would be better. So, and finally, while the regulations are not yet finalized, we're still awaiting for them after they went on how do you say that? They went to the employers and the unions and the lobbying body to ask their opinion. We're still awaiting, but you can look at it and start doing some preliminary steps at this point in time, because 3 years can go very fast once the gunshot starts at the federal level. Back to you, Peter.
Thanks, Francois. I appreciate that and your insights and information. So we're going to move into our next phase of the presentation. It's a panel discussion with Francois, myself, and Barb. And to kick that part off, we thought we'd start off by discussing more thoughts around the limited concept of equity definition, because I think that can create some gray area for most of us in our organizations. So Francois or Barb, which one of you want to go first on that one?
I might speak to Ontario. Obviously,
sure,
the federal situation isn't finalized. I think if you have a sound compensation program with strong logic behind your job evaluation levels, the ranges and salary structure that you create, and some logic and consistency in terms of how you distribute salaries within that range, this doesn't have as big a problem as if, so if that's the ongoing process that you have in place, and you're just verifying that when you look at all the jobs within a particular level, that you don't have all your male-dominated jobs at the top and all your female at the bottom. But if your male jobs are paid where they should be in the range, either based on seniority or based on performance, or a sound salary administration program, as well, gender-neutral jobs are, really for pay equity, you're just looking if there's some place where that has failed to recognize the female-dominated jobs levels. And I've done a number of these, and over time, there still tends to be certain job families like marketing jobs or HR jobs, which tend to be populated more by females, where they may be a little lower within the range. And so there may be an adjustment that's required. But I'm a real strong believer in having a good overall sound compensation program, and then just verifying you don't have a discrimination against women that might be impacted by that wage gap, because we can be impacted by that in the just simple fact that it exists. So when we go to recruit for some jobs, we might be recruiting in a pool of female-dominated candidates, and they're not asking for the same level of salary that a male would, and the negotiation power and so forth, you might end up with an inequity without even intending to. So I think that may not be the case, but I think if we acknowledge first off that the wage gap exists and that it isn't an individual employer problem, it's a cultural problem, it's a it's a Canadian problem, and we design really good systems, we shouldn't run into too many times where the only person getting the adjustment is the female and the other jobs are somehow hurt by that. I think if we have sound systems and then we just verify that we've done everything we can in our own organizations to eliminate that wage gap, then I think we're good. Those are my thoughts on that.
Anything you want to add, Francois?
Yeah, I would agree fully with Barb. If you have put a system, a formal system that covers all of your jobs and structure, in the end, you should not be exposed potentially to any issues or gap at that level. I just want to stress out again, however, the education of your employees and the communication so they clearly understand what's in scope sometimes and what is not. Not to come back to the cases I've mentioned, but I've saw a few situations where high-tech technicians went to the pay equity in Quebec saying that he didn't like to have overtime guaranteed pay and a premium because of his skills, and he wanted that folded into his base salary, and he asked the pay equity committee to look into it. The pay equity came in that company. They didn't want to look at him at all. They started to look at all the women jobs that can compare to his position, and the individual was kind of puzzled around, why aren't you looking at my job? This is what I want. So it's just that education and communication, because the concept can at one point be mixed up by employees, I would say.
I would agree with you both. I think at the end of the day, the pay equity legislation is to try to address the gender gap, but overall organizations, if they focus on ensuring that their compensation practices are minimized from a discriminatory purpose all over the place, it should minimize those kinds of situations. However, I'm sure that there will be those kinds of situations that arise because of our historical approach to pay in North America from that perspective. It's funny, we've been talking about the importance of the collective bargaining unions in this whole process. What do you guys think their approach is going to be from a pay equity perspective in your dealings with the unions that you've dealt with?
Sorry, Peter, can you repeat the question?
I guess the question I'm asking is, do you think the unions approach to pay equity in their collective bargaining approach, how do you think they're going to approach dealing with the employers from a pay equity perspective?
Maybe I can start on this one.
Sorry.
Go
ahead, Francois, sorry.
Well, what I saw on our side is really, when you look at various unions, you'll have some that are, let's say, technicians based, and others will be more clerical and maybe more women or female dominated based. So the approach can vary significantly from one union to another. The only thing I saw, let's say at Bell, however, if you look at the clerical, that was predominantly women in the past. It's starting to have men job in there, men-dominated jobs in that clerical, and the dynamic is changing. So I think the union are somewhat divided if, let's say, it's an all-man technician and they just see that they can potentially lose because everyone will compare to them if they're higher paid, and a more woman-based union that is looking into this and wants to go ahead. So the audience can vary greatly, I think, depending on what kind of unions you have.
Peter, do you mind if I add something to that?
No, go ahead, please.
In Ontario, I work with a wide variety of unions, and I've seen a wide variety of responses, even from the same union in different units, depending on what serves them best for their initiatives or what they're trying to get. So if they feel like they want to get some more money for some of their members, they might be pushing, we need to comply with pay equity. Whereas in other cases, that same union might be on another issue that isn't directly related to pay. And so they don't feel they want to bring that forward. So much like I had mentioned about the trends with employers being sort of passive about compliance, I've found in Ontario, especially even with female-dominated unions, some passivity as well. And when it serves their interest, they're on board with doing it, and where it isn't, it isn't. And so I think unions are acting the same way as employers are. Sometimes we believe the legislation exists and we should comply and we're going to push for it. Other times it goes to sleep and nobody talks about it. So definitely, I would say they're in lockstep with how the employers are responding in Ontario right now.
Actually, I would agree with you both, because in my own experience, I've had the same experience where the union's approach is different based on the situation they have with respect to their members. In some cases, they're very aggressive with pay equity. In some cases, they don't want to even deal with pay equity because of their internal structures and I guess their membership status issues in terms of addressing, unfortunately, structures in the collective agreement that probably don't meet the pay equity definition, but they don't want to deal with issues where more senior members of the unions get paid more than other members, but their jobs probably aren't worth as much. So it's going to be an interesting perspective, and from a federal perspective, how the unions that represent federal regulated organizations approach this situation and deal with those kinds of issues. I think many organizations see implementing pay equity as a very onerous and expensive initiative. What would you say to organizations that see it that way? What kind of advice would you give them?
I might address that, Peter.
Sure.
I think that Francois's recommendations on being prepared is an excellent way to make this process easier. I've been doing designing and implementing job evaluation and pay equity systems for a long time, and I can tell you right from the get-go, if an organization has well-written, well understood and agreed to job descriptions, and a good understanding of the organization structure, and has a representative group, whether that be an HR or whether that be a committee, depending on your requirements, the process is 100 times easier than if people don't understand the jobs, there's disagreement on what's required in the job, and if changes are happening with jobs. So I've had job evaluation exercises where, you know, we could evaluate 35 jobs in a day, and I've had them where we couldn't evaluate 2 jobs in a day. And it really came down to starting with a really strong foundation of documentation and understanding and agreement on what the jobs are and what they aren't, and ensuring that you're clearly describing the job, not the person doing the job, because that's the other piece, is if the individual doing the job is somehow changed the job, but there isn't an understanding of whether that's officially the job or just what the incumbent's doing. If you've got that lack of clarity, job evaluation is a nightmare. If you have a clear, well-documented foundation in place, job evaluation is possible to be very straightforward. Also, there are different kinds of job evaluation systems. Some are more complicated than others, and you have to look at what's going to be right for your organization. Obviously, compliance is key, but some are more straightforward than others, and that's something to consider when you're going through it, is not only being really well organized and prepared in your committee, if you have one, and or those participating well trained, but also there are really good, straightforward systems available now that might not have been available years ago.
Anything you want to add to that, Francois?
Yes, I support everything Barb is saying, and I would add it transcends pay equity. I mean, Bell Canada has acquired a lot of little companies over the years, and when you go into these companies and they're lacking salary structure, job descriptions, or job evaluations, you see that you inherit like a structure that is a little bit all over the map. And there are benefits when we get in order to put some order into it. So it's not necessarily related to pay equity, but it's to put something in place that makes sense economically for the company, paying the job the right value they deserve versus what was invented over time by the previous owners or the previous leaders of these companies. So it's really helping you getting a good sense of a structure. You need to invest time and money on that for sure. But another example I can give you for us in the media industry, you have so many unique roles to think that we can go on the market and find matches for all of these various roles in the media industry. We quickly saw that it's quite impossible, and to rely on job evaluation and internal equity is even more important at that point in time.
That totally makes sense.
But for sure, you need to invest the time and efforts for that.
Also, just before we move on to the discussion, I just want to remind the participants that they do have any questions that they want to submit. There's the Q&A button that you can pop on and type in your question, and we'll be able to answer it in the next phase of our discussion, which is the Q&A section. But just to further on what Barb and Francois said about their points there, I also think the other important aspect is, in most cases, I think you guys will both agree with me, when you have your committees developed, your evaluations, your pay equity committees, spending enough time and energy to make sure those participants and people that are contributing are trained well enough and understand what their roles are, what they're there to do, and how to understand the whole system, what pay equity is, what gender neutral is, what gender gap is. All those specifics would help ensure that the outcome is going to be more positive, because in most cases the participants are going to be non-HR experts, and they don't know the amount of information that typically someone who's been in HR would know from a job evaluation, salary, market comparisons, all those things. So spending the time up front to make sure that your committee is well trained and educated should ensure that the process goes a little bit more smoothly. That's been my experience, and I think you probably say the same thing, Barb, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Without effective training with your committees, you're going to be spending a lot of time going in circles from that perspective.
I also think it's an extremely tiring exercise, and you can't leave it to the last minute or try to rush it, because the more you rush it, the more agitated people get, and you can get into more disagreements. So that you need to have it scheduled well in advance, have time set aside for it, but have lots of breaks. And I often joke with people, when you're finished, you often suffer from a job evaluation hangover because you're so tired out. And that's normal. So you have to allow for it. And when we're all multitasking and trying to do 40 different things at once, you need to have dedicated resources to this who can have the patience to take you from the beginning to the end and get it done right. If you're trying to do 40 things at once and you're stressed, this whole process can be that much more difficult, because you're having to debate and discuss issues over and over again all day long as part of the process. And needless to say, you also, I'm sure it's needless to say, you need a good facilitator who knows when to stop, take a break, get more information, help the committee succeed.
And I was just going to add that I think a neutral facilitator would probably be the most effective way to manage those kinds of situations. Someone who's not on either party's side would be helpful, in my opinion.
And those of us that have done it a million times also are hard pressed to say we haven't seen it all. So it's something that might stress out someone who hasn't the experience. Someone with the experience will have a resolution too.
That's true. Let's say, look, we got a couple questions. Let's see. What is the minimum amount of employees in a workplace before you need to have a committee?
So that's an interesting one, Peter. At the new federal law, basically, is you need to have over 100 employees to have a committee. However, as soon as you have one union, one bargaining unit, you need a committee also at that level. So this is an interesting dynamic of, normally it's over 100, but as soon as you have a union, there is a committee that is put into place.
There is
Okay.
no requirement for a committee under the Ontario law. However, if you have a bargaining unit, you have to be deemed as working together to comply. So chances are you'll have a committee in that case, but you don't have to have one if you're non-unionized and, you know, doing pay equity. You can do it within your own HR department.
Yeah, and if I can just add, Peter, on the federal side, of course, if you have less than 100, you can do it as the employer. You need to inform the employees you do not need a committee if there's no union. And if you're below 10, you may consider yourself out of scope. But I just want to remind you that the CHRA, pay equity complaint-driven system, still apply to employers that have less than 10 employees. So the pay equity is not going away. The current complaint system stays for these smaller employers.
Okay, we have another question. If we don't have any female-dominated jobs in our unions, do we still have to have a union rep for each union on our pay equity committee? Interesting.
So
yeah.
I was going to say for
Barbara.
Ontario, the law requires you to do pay equity by establishment, which could be the employer as a whole, or it could be each bargaining unit, but only if there's female-dominated jobs. So if you have a 100% male-dominated union, you don't need to do pay equity unless there's a reason to potentially use those jobs as male comparators, but I would be suggesting you try everything else other than that first, because chances are those are higher levels than you may have in your non-union group.
Francois, you're going to add something?
Yeah, at the federal level, while you say that there's not female dominated in those unions, these male dominated unions can become comparator to other unions where you have women or non-management, non-unionized employees. So it's difficult to write them off simply like that. However, you will recall I said you can break down your single plan into multiple plans, and some of those unions that are only male or men predominant jobs could ask to be excluded basically or on their own, and then you don't have to do a lot of work if there's no comparisons to make. However, remember what I said. If taking those men-dominated jobs out is jeopardizing finding proper men equivalent, then it can be denied. So it all depends on who will be your comparator to your woman-dominated jobs.
Makes sense. So that answers the questions that we've had. So we're almost at our time limit for today, and so I just thought I'd ask both Francois and Barb if they have any last points that they want to make, and then we can sign off. Barb, Francois, anything you want to add to his last point?
I just have one quick process question, Peter.
Sure.
And this is maybe everybody knows the answer and it's only me that doesn't. I noticed a number of interesting questions coming up on the chat. How are they dealt with?
Their chats. I'm looking at the chats.
I see there's 10, and I don't want to click on it because I'm not managing the webinar, but there were some interesting questions that came up there, and I just wondered.
Well, it's if we can. So here's a couple of. What is the minimum amount of employees that you have to have a committee?
Right.
I think we answered that one.
Yeah.
How do we know if the female, male, or a neutral job?
So I saw that question and thought maybe we could quickly address that because we didn't get into the tests. And then is it okay if I go ahead and answer that, Peter?
Go ahead.
Okay, in Ontario, and Francois can just confirm what the case is federally, there's 3 tests to determine whether or not a job is female dominated. So in other words, whether it's 60% female amongst the incumbents. And I think I'll just clearly just say up front that if you have a single incumbent job, it's whatever gender the individual is in that job, because then it's 100% female or 100% male. In terms of multiple incumbent jobs, you first look at what it actually is. Then you also look at what it's been historically. So you know, the joke going when the legislation was first passed is you couldn't take all your executive assistants and fire them and hire men and make it a male-dominated job, because that job in society is deemed as female-dominated and or has been historically. And then you look also at what it is in society. So if you said there's an executive assistant or a nurse or a teller behind X door, what would everybody think the gender is? And if the majority of people would say it's female, then it's female dominated. So what they did with those tests was tried to make as many jobs as possible female dominated so they would be covered by the act. So that was the intent in why they put all those tests in place. Francois, is there anything different in the federal legislation?
What I would add on the federal is, like I mentioned earlier, even though you look at your current state, they stressed out in the law that you also need to look at your historical trend. So, as you just said, Barb, if your president is a woman, and typically people think it should be a man from past historical experience, then even though it's a woman, it could be tagged as a men predominant job. The other elements that can be interesting at the federal level is, you know, there exists with the employment equity, the NOC code, the National Occupancy Codes. And if you go on Statistics Canada website, they have statistics on those NOC codes of the prevailing gender dominance for these jobs. So that could be also something that you can look into, that in your company, let's say your finance people are women, but maybe when you look at the NOC code, it could be defined as a man stereotype because of those statistics that you can get from Statistics Canada. So it could be interesting to look into those codes at the federal level also.
It's my understanding in Ontario, though, Francois, that if any one of those tests makes a job female, so the president's female now, it's female.
Yeah, that's my understanding too.
Use it as an argument to make it not female. You use it to make it so that. So I think if you had a president of a company and said, "Oh yeah, well, typically that's male dominated. If it's female in your organization, it's female."
Okay, from what I know at the federal level, it was not that clear when we had various meetings. They were very inclined of what was the past experience and what was the past population of these jobs, and also the NOC codes trends that we see across Canada.
And that makes sense because we don't have that in the private sector in Ontario, right?
Correct. So we have one last Q&A question here, and it says, is this apply to female-dominated jobs? What if you are paying as your employee based on their work regardless of female and male? I'm not quite sure exactly what that question is asking, but
well,
that's what...
maybe I can cover that one.
Sure.
People say sometimes they set up a salary scale and they don't look at the gender, and they have set it up at, let's say, $25 an hour. And unfortunately, just saying that is not enough. You really need to make those comparators after the fact and look at if there's predominance in real life and in the history, or even, like I said, on the NOC codes. You cannot simply say you're good. You need to really make those tests and exercise.
I would also say that if you came to the determination of the $25 per hour by looking at the market, you need to acknowledge the market is biased against women and accept that. And then, as Francois said, go through the tests. So chances are, if you do have a really good system, you'll have very limited negative or frustrating things that come out of pay equity. But you're more than likely going to find the odd one that comes up because, as I said, you're bringing people into your organization from the marketplace, and the marketplace has a bias against female-dominated jobs. I've done pay equity analysis in multiple companies over the last 20 years, and I can't tell you how many times the person who hired me, the HR person, the female-dominated HR person, was the one person who had the requirement for a pay equity adjustment, or the marketing person. And sometimes it's the most senior person too, this most senior female dominated job. And I wanted to just quickly mention for Ontario that Francois mentioned a number of times about executives. They've always been part of the Ontario pay equity compliance requirements. But in Ontario, we don't include contractors or non-deemed to be formal employees. And Peter, you had suggested a few minutes ago closing comments, so maybe I can just jump in and give mine and then.
Yes, perfect timing.
Okay, so I come back to what I said earlier. This is a process that can be onerous. It is particularly onerous when you're not organized, when you haven't done the pre-work, when you haven't got your jobs well-defined, job descriptions well organized. And if you have your homework done and you have the basics done, this can be a lot less painful of an exercise, not only for the HR people and the people responsible for executing it, for every member of the committee and everyone who's involved. So take the time to do your homework in advance, get yourself organized, and the process can be, well, maybe enjoyable for me, but maybe not for other people, but less of an onerous process and more satisfying for everyone who's involved.
And Francois, any last comments?
I just want simply to reiterate that the regulations are still not out there. And if you're familiar with federal laws, you have the law, but the whole devil's is in the details in the regulations. As I said earlier, employers, unions, and lobbying bodies have pushed for changes to those regulations. So it's possible that what we discussed today may swing a little bit in the end, but the elements and the questions I raised in the meeting, I think you can start to look into it, but don't take everything for granted until we see the end product, basically.
All right, thank you, guys. I want to thank you, Francois and Barb, for sharing your knowledge, your thoughts, and your experiences. I think the participants have gained some new knowledge or reintegrated additional knowledge to help them in their both provincial and federal pay equity journeys. And we thank you for joining us today, and have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you.